In the forgotten corners of Asia, where mist clings to the roots of banyan trees, and wind chimes whisper names long erased from family scrolls, the dead do not rest. Here, every village has a secret, a ritual never spoken of beyond the mountains, a curse buried beneath generations of silence, and a lantern that should never be lit. Welcome to FolkFear, where ancestral sins echo through shadowed halls, where ghost marriages bind the living to the dead, and where ancient rites still demand blood. These are not stories made for comfort. These are truths buried beneath red silk, bone ash, and broken vows. Tonight, we begin another descent into a tale passed down in whispers and warnings, a tale of betrayal, of rituals forbidden, and of a bride who still waits beneath the tree where no grass grows. This is the Widow Lantern Rite. The road to Lantern Village was no longer on any map. Wei Jun noticed this too late, somewhere past the crumbling milestone that marked the last known town. His phone signal had died an hour ago, and the bus that dropped him off now seemed like a relic from another time, more shadow than machine, swallowed by the fog the moment it turned around. He stood alone on the roadside, where the earth was red and moist beneath his boots, the air heavy with the scent of wet bamboo and old smoke. A thin footpath stretched into the hills, barely visible between hunched trees, where the trunks leaned inward like they were hiding something or waiting. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell him when he was a boy, about trees that listened, about lanterns that never went out, about brides who never made it to the altar. He had thought they were just tales to keep him from wandering off. But now, with her ashes sealed in a clay urn tucked deep inside his backpack, and a village he hadn't seen in 15 years, hidden somewhere up ahead, the stories didn't feel like stories anymore. They felt like warnings. June reached the village by dusk. It was smaller than he remembered and much older. Time had stripped the color from the rooftops and peeled paint from doorways. The air was colder here, though he was certain the altitude wasn't high enough to justify it. As he stepped into the main path, villagers paused their sweeping, their chopping, their smoking, their games. Some looked at him with faint recognition, most didn't. A group of children playing with sticks stopped mid-laugh. One little girl whispered something to the others in a dialect he barely understood. They dropped their sticks and scattered. June adjusted the strap of his pack and kept walking. The village hadn't changed, but it had grown heavier, darker, quieter. Like the silence between thunder and lightning, stretched thin and waiting to snap. He passed the old temple, the one with the cracked dragon columns and rusted incense pots. It had once held festivals and laughter. Now the banners were sun-bleached and torn, and the prayer drums looked like they hadn't been struck in years. On the far end of the village, beyond the communal well and the disused schoolhouse, was the home that had belonged to his grandmother, Cao Nian. A wooden gate, slanted tiled roof, the windows shuttered. The house stood apart from the others, as if the soil beneath it had shifted and the rest of the village had respectfully stepped back. The key she'd sent in the mail, wrapped in wax paper with no letter, slid into the rusted lock with surprising ease. The door creaked open. Dust lay thick on every surface inside. The air was stale with sandalwood, dried herbs, and something else, faintly metallic, like blood too old to stain. June's grandmother had passed only 3 weeks ago. The official cause was heart failure. He had tried to come sooner, but temple duties in Kunming delayed him. She had no other living family, no husband, no children, but her late mother. Now June was here to collect her remains, sort through her life, and perhaps find answers to the things that had always been left unsaid. He lit a bundle of joss sticks and placed them in the iron urn by the doorway. As the smoke rose, he bowed 3 times to the silent house and muttered under his breath the words his master had taught him. "In life I did not kneel, but in death I honor." Thunder groaned far away. That night he dreamed of red silk, long corridors draped in red, brides walking backward, lanterns dangling from bone-white arms, a veiled figure standing in the distance, her hands held out, her face covered. The sound of weeping echoed in the dream, not from her, but from behind him. He turned, but no one was there, only an altar and a blackened lantern that flickered once and then hissed. He woke up choking. Smoke! His eyes snapped open. The incense had burned down, but no fire, no danger, only the lingering scent of something old and sour and unclean. June sat up in the bed his grandmother once used. Something creaked in the house, floorboards, or perhaps something else. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and lit a candle. That's when he noticed it, a faint glow behind the wooden screen of the back room, a room he hadn't entered yet, the ancestral altar room. His grandmother always kept it locked when he visited as a child. She said the dead had no interest in the living, and the living had no right to disturb the dead. But the door was ajar now, and something inside was softly glowing. He didn't go in, not that night. Instead, he stood at the threshold, the candle trembling in his hand, and stared through the crack. Inside, he could make out the edge of a wooden stand, piles of burnt offerings, rows of stone tablets with names carved deep into them, all of them covered in dust. And on the center of the altar, surrounded by ashes and dried petals, was a black metal lantern, unlit, and yet, somehow, still glowing. A soft red pulse, like the heart of something waiting. The next morning, June visited the village head, an old man named Wen Da, whom he vaguely remembered for his booming voice and strict temple sermons. Wen Da was older now, frailer. His voice was not booming, but broken. When he saw June, he shook his head and muttered, "She never should have sent for you." June explained his purpose, the urn, the house, the documents, and the strange lantern. Wen Da looked past him toward the banyan forest beyond the rooftops. 3 nights from now, the Lantern Rite begins. June blinked. "I don't remember that festival." "You wouldn't," Wen Da said, his eyes distant. "Your mother took you away before you were old enough to ask why some brides are never wed in life, only in death." That night, June lit the candle again. He stood outside the ancestral room, and he listened. Softly, like wind beneath floorboards, he heard it. Not weeping this time, but breathing. The next morning, the fog didn't lift. It hung low across Lantern Village like a burial shroud, clinging to rooftops and drifting between the stilts of old homes. The sun was a pale disk, struggling behind gray. Everything looked damp and faded, as if the village were slowly dissolving. Wei Jun stood by the well, staring at the surface of the water. It didn't reflect him, only the clouds. He dipped his hand in, cold, still. Behind him, an old woman shuffled past with a basket of joss paper and bone-white chrysanthemums. She didn't look at him, but as she passed, she muttered something beneath her breath, something half chant, half warning, then vanished into the fog. June turned back to the water. Still no reflection. He spent the rest of the day going through his grandmother's belongings. The house felt strange in the daylight, too quiet. The furniture hadn't been moved in years. Every cabinet still smelled like dried oranges, salt, and iron. He found old envelopes tucked into floorboards, money offerings folded into triangles, and talismans burned halfway through. The back room, the altar room, remained closed, but the memory of the glow haunted him. Not a flickering light, not the warmth of fire. It had been steady, pulsing, like a heartbeat from something buried. He kept thinking of the dream, the corridors of silk, the backwards brides, the black lantern at the center of it all. He knew he had to go back in. That evening, as the sky darkened and the villagers began lighting incense on their doorsteps, June returned to the altar room. The door creaked open on its own. He stepped inside. The air was stale and thick with sandalwood that no longer masked the scent beneath, something sour and old, like decayed silk or mold growing on dried blood. The room was small. The altar took up most of it. A carved wooden table, incense bowls, 3 ancestral tablets marked with red brushstrokes, and behind them, the lantern. It was black metal, ornately shaped, edges curled into sharp points like talons. The glass was opaque, stained dark with smoke. It had no wick, no oil, no place for flame. And yet it glowed, not brightly, just enough to breathe. June stepped closer. The glow shifted briefly. He saw something, a veil, a mouth behind it, and 2 fingers pressed against the glass from the inside. He fell backward, knocking over a brass bowl filled with coins and bone fragments. The noise clattered into the silence like a scream. Dust filled the air. He scrambled back to his feet, but the lantern no longer glowed. Only darkness behind the smoked glass. No mouth, no fingers. He wasn't sure what he had seen, but the feeling remained, the sense that the lantern wasn't just an object. It was watching. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid. He stood in a temple with no roof. Rain poured through the sky like ink. Paper brides sat in rows on wooden pews, heads bowed, their faces painted with red circles, lips stitched shut. At the altar stood a woman in red. Her veil was soaked. Her gown clung to her form like wet skin. Her hands were outstretched. She didn't speak, but her voice filled the dream anyway. "You left me." She lifted her veil. Her face was a blur of ash and fire, empty sockets, no lips, only a glowing ember where her heart should be, pulsing in time with the lantern. "You are the last of her blood. You must finish what she would not." Jun woke up to the sound of his door creaking open. He rushed to the altar room. The lantern was gone. In its place was a trail of ash. It led out into the hallway, through the kitchen, and stopped at the front door, which was wide open. Outside, the fog was thicker than before. Jun stepped out barefoot, the cold soil biting his skin. The ash trail stopped abruptly at the gate. Beyond it, nothing but the whiteness of early dawn. He turned to go back inside, and then he saw it. At the edge of the path, just beyond the well, The lantern stood, glowing faintly. He approached slowly. It sat in the center of the path, as if waiting to be picked up. He crouched. The air around it was freezing. Frost began to collect on the grass beneath it, the moisture in the air crystallizing around its base. He reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the handle, the lantern flared, not with fire, but with memory. Suddenly, he was standing in his grandmother's altar room, only it was years ago. She was younger, kneeling before the same lantern, whispering. She held a red cord in her hands, and beside her, another figure knelt, a woman in red, silent, still, veiled. His grandmother looked terrified. She whispered again, but the woman didn't move. Then, without warning, the lantern sparked, and his grandmother screamed. The vision vanished. June collapsed onto the wet earth, the lantern in his hands once again dark. He stared at it. What had his grandmother done? Who had she bound? Why was the woman in red inside the lantern? He brought it back into the house and placed it back on the altar. As he did, he noticed something strange on the base of the lantern, a faint etching, barely visible beneath soot and time. A name, Leon, and beneath it, scratched deeper, "Do not wed the widow." The words made his blood run cold. June sat cross-legged before the altar. The incense he lit refused to stay burning. The air turned sour again. And from deep inside the lantern, he heard it, not weeping, not breathing, this time humming, a slow, mournful bridal tune, the kind sung when the bride walks alone. Rain came that night, not as thunder or storm, but in slow, persistent sheets that soaked the earth and made the village pathways glisten like ink. Roofs dripped steadily. Wooden beams groaned under the weight of moisture and years. Wei Jun sat awake in his grandmother's study, wrapped in an old wool robe that still carried her scent, camphor, herbal ointment, and something faintly like ashes. He had placed the lantern back in the altar room. This time he tied a red string charm around the door handles, not to seal the spirit in, but to remind himself never to open it again. He wasn't sure it would help. The humming had stopped, but he knew she was still inside, waiting. He turned to the scrolls. They had been buried beneath the floorboards in the back of the study, hidden beneath loose planks, sealed in oilskin and bound with 3 layers of string. Old Taoist habits, he thought. Inside were yellowed papers, brittle with age. Some were inked by brush, others stamped with crimson seals. Each one detailed something familiar and yet horrifying in its implications. They were marriage contracts, but not for the living. Each one recorded the names of a deceased man and a deceased woman, often annotated with dates, death causes, and locations of burial. Some included diagrams of ritual altars, offerings made, and the name of the officiating Taoist. Ghost marriages. He had read about them, studied the theory in monastic texts. In rural villages, especially near Yunnan and the Vietnamese border, it was considered a tragedy for someone to die unmarried, especially women. Their spirits were thought to linger, angry and incomplete. To appease them, families arranged posthumous weddings, sometimes between 2 dead souls, sometimes, more dangerously, between a dead spirit and a living spouse. The purpose was always the same:
to quiet the wandering, to bind the angry, to restore spiritual balance. June turned to a scroll bound in red string, thicker than the others. It was older, ink faded. His grandmother's handwriting filled the margins, shaky and urgent. The scroll detailed a ghost marriage that had never been completed. The groom's name was listed, Liang Bao, died 1979, age 21, fall from a river cliff. The bride's name was scratched out, violently. Not once, but again and again until the parchment tore through, and beneath it, scribbled in the lower corner in black ink, "Offer false ashes, bind with lantern, burn no red thread." June stared at the words. False ashes? He flipped the scroll over. On the reverse side was a single brush stroke, a sigil used only in one type of Taoist rite, spirit suppression. But it had been drawn hastily, sloppily, and beneath it an unfinished prayer. To the soul denied her path, forgive what we have done. The ink trailed off, as if interrupted. June leaned back, his mind racing. His grandmother had officiated a ghost marriage and then betrayed it. The spirit, the bride, had never been wed. Her ashes were fake. Her soul, instead of being joined to the groom, had been sealed, trapped in the black lantern, bound, not freed. He felt sick. The next scroll was different, newer, from just 5 years ago. It documented another ghost marriage. This one had been performed for 2 newly dead villagers, both under 30. A full ritual, red strings, dual urns, twin lanterns. Witnesses listed. One name stood out, Wen Da. So the village head had been part of this too. He realized the implications. The lantern rite wasn't just symbolic, it was real. The village still practiced ghost marriages, still performed the rites, still believed, and perhaps still feared what might happen if they didn't. He rubbed his eyes. The candle beside him had burned low. Outside, the rain had slowed, but a strange sound lingered just beneath it. A distant tapping, not on the roof, not at the door, but from the floor below. He stood, following the sound to the altar room. The red string across the handles was broken, the door ajar. Inside, the lantern sat exactly where he'd left it. But something had changed. There was now a second object on the altar. A folded paper bride, crisp, new, her face hand-drawn in ink, 2 closed eyes, a red dot on the forehead, and a thin smile. He picked it up. The bottom was stained with ash. He turned it over. On the back was a name had been written, Wei Jun. His heart stopped. He stepped back, trembling. From inside the lantern, the glow returned, this time brighter. It flickered, then pulsed. A soft knock echoed behind him. He turned sharply. No one, just the wind brushing through the eaves. He looked back at the altar. The paper bride was gone. Only ash remained. June didn't sleep. He sat in the study until dawn, surrounding himself with the scrolls, the seals, the written words of his grandmother's desperate penmanship. He understood now. The woman in the lantern, Lian, had once been promised a wedding, denied. She had not forgiven it. And now, through bloodline and ritual, she had chosen him, Wei Jun, as her groom. At sunrise, a knock came at the door, this one real. He opened it to find a girl standing barefoot in the mist, eyes downcast, a red ribbon tied around her wrist. She looked no older than 18. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They said you're her grandson." He nodded. The girl raised her eyes. "They said you should come. The elders are preparing the next pairing." He blinked. "The next what?" "The next ghost wedding." She stepped aside, revealing a line of villagers in the distance, walking toward the temple, carrying incense, carrying urns, carrying lanterns. The rite had begun, and this year someone would be chosen again. Maybe dead, maybe alive.
The temple stood on the highest ridge of Lantern Village. Time had worn down its stone steps, and moss had crept up the walls, softening the once fierce carvings of guardian beasts. Wind chimes hung from every corner of the roof, crafted not from metal, but from bone. Small, pale pieces strung together with red thread, clinking softly with the passing breeze. As Wei Jun followed the girl through the fog, he saw the villagers gathering at the base of the steps. No one spoke. The procession moved like a funeral march, solemn, silent, eyes lowered. At the front, 4 men carried a wide red cloth between them, stretched like a canopy. Beneath it walked a woman. She wore a long red gown embroidered with phoenixes and peonies, her hands folded neatly at her waist. Her face was hidden behind a heavy red veil. A bell was tied to her wrist, barely making a sound with each slow step. Wei Jun recognized her. May, the girl from the gate, now dressed as a ghost bride. Inside the temple, everything smelled of old incense and wet paper. Jun had not been inside since he was a child. The space felt smaller than he remembered, the ceiling lower, the shadows longer. Paper talismans lined the beams, fluttering slightly though there was no wind. 2 urns sat on the altar, side by side. The names had not yet been painted. A brush on a pot of cinnabar ink waited beside them. On the floor lay the ritual objects: bowls of salt, plates of rice, miniature paper houses, folded garments, and 2 lanterns, one red, one black. Jun froze. The black lantern looked identical to the one in his grandmother's altar. The same shape, the same clawed frame. But this one was unlit, or perhaps waiting to be lit. Wenda stood by the altar, head bowed. He held a long scroll in his hands, unrolling it slowly as the villagers formed a wide circle around the bride. He began to chant, not loudly, but with rhythm. Each word struck like a drumbeat, ancient phrases, binding syllables, a tongue older than the villagers themselves. The girl in red never moved, not once. Only the bell on her wrist trembled. Jun stood at the back, unseen, uninvited, but allowed. The elders knew who he was. They knew his bloodline, and perhaps they expected him to be there, because he was part of this now, whether he wanted to or not. As the chanting continued, 2 men brought forward a carved tablet wrapped in yellow cloth. They placed it between the urns. Jun leaned forward, trying to read the inscription. It was the name of the groom, the dead man to whom May was being married. Joe Ren, age 29, died 1 month ago, fell from a roof. Jun's chest tightened.
He recognized the name. He'd seen it in one of the scrolls, a previously paired soul. But the record was incomplete, as if the ceremony had failed once and was now being repeated. May knelt. Wenda turned to the urns. He dipped the brush into the cinnabar ink and painted the names across both vessels, one for Jo Ren, one for May. Jun watched in silence as the black lantern was lifted by the eldest woman in the village and placed between the urns. Then came the offering. Hair, threads of red silk, burned rice, blood from the bride's fingertip pressed onto paper, folded into the lantern like a promise. The bell on her wrist rang only once. Only once. Jun's breath caught. He saw something, just for a second, move inside the black lantern. A flicker, a shape, a mouth, open, smiling. The final part of the ritual took place outside beneath the banyan tree at the edge of the village. The ancient tree towered above everything, its roots swollen like veins, gnarled and dark. Hundreds of red ribbons hung from its branches, each tied with names, prayers, regrets. At its base was a hollow in the earth, freshly dug. 2 small lanterns, one red, one black, were placed inside. A wooden lid was lowered over the hollow, sealed with melted wax and a pressed sigil. Jun stood at the edge of the crowd, frozen. The lanterns were buried, bound, the bride still veiled. May rose to her feet with help, but she did not look back. She simply walked back toward the village, the bell on her wrist, silent. Later that night, Jun found her sitting alone by the shrine near the well. The veil was gone. Her face was pale, but composed. She held a paper fan in her lap, unmoving. "You let them bury you with a dead man." Jun's voice trembled. May didn't look at him. "It's better than letting him roam." Her fingers brushed the edge of the fan. "The dead don't like being forgotten." Jun crouched beside her. "That lantern, it looked like the one in my grandmother's altar." She closed the fan. "They all look the same, but they're not." He hesitated. "What if the ritual fails?" She finally looked at him. "Then the bride is taken too." That night, Jun couldn't sleep. The images burned in his mind. The veil, the chanting, the black lantern, the buried flames. He stood before his grandmother's altar once more. The lantern there flickered, not steadily, but like something struggling to breathe. He whispered into the room, "I know who you are." No reply, only humming, soft, like a lullaby. But it was not comfort, because it was not meant to soothe. It was meant to lure.
Jun waited until the sky dimmed and the bells of the village temple fell silent. The hush that came after the lantern rite was different from ordinary silence. It was weighted, stretched thin like cloth left too long under rain. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow. Jun lit a single stick of incense and walked barefoot into his grandmother's altar room. The red string charm he had tied earlier now lay on the floor, split cleanly down the center. The lantern still sat on the altar, its dull glow steady, but it no longer looked harmless. It looked aware. Jun approached the altar slowly. He had searched every visible part of the room before, but now, with the black lantern pulsing and the village buried in fog, he knew there was more hidden here.
He placed the incense in the holder and bowed 3 times. Then he moved the offerings aside, the old scrolls, the joss paper, and the cracked bowl of dried lotus seeds. His hands traced the surface of the altar. There, a small ridge near the base. He pressed against it. The wooden panel shifted. A secret compartment. Dust poured out as the panel slid free, revealing a narrow cavity lined in silk. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in red burial cloth, charred at the corners. With trembling fingers, June pulled it out and unwrapped it. Inside were bones, small, fragile, burnt black at the ends. Wrapped around them was a length of red bridal ribbon. The cloth bore ink stains, not from prayers, but names. 2 names written in the same handwriting, Liang Bao and Lian. Below them, a single character written in darker ink, false. June staggered backward. This wasn't just a broken ritual. This was deliberate deception. He turned back to the compartment. Deeper inside was an urn, cracked along the rim, sealed with red wax that had half melted from age. He pulled it out carefully, heart pounding. On its side was painted a character that chilled him. Substitute. June pried the lid open. Ash. Not fine, but coarse, mixed with fragments of burned paper, bone, and something else. Threads of red silk, half-melted beads, and small, brittle teeth. He recoiled. The ashes weren't human. They were fabricated. A ruse. June's grandmother hadn't just failed the ritual. She had faked it. She had offered counterfeit remains during the wedding of Lian, whoever she had once been, and sealed the true remains under the altar, hidden from spirit and shrine alike. June sat on the floor, the urn beside him. The lantern on the altar flickered sharply, then steadied, and then it whispered. Not words, not breath, but the unmistakable sound of cloth dragging across wood. He looked up. A shadow passed across the altar wall, thin, draped, head bowed, a veil fluttering, though there was no breeze. He didn't move. The shadow paused, then vanished. He crawled forward and picked up the ribbon-wrapped bones again. They were light in his hands, lighter than they should have been, but the heat that radiated from them, a cold, crawling heat, seeped into his fingers. He placed them on the altar beside the lantern. The light inside the glass dimmed for a moment, as if uncertain, then pulsed once, brighter than before. A shape pressed against the glass, a face beneath a veil, lips drawn back in a smile that wasn't joy. The lantern hissed. A curl of smoke rose from the wickless center. June backed away. The air in the room tightened. He fled into the main house. Outside, the fog had crept beneath the doors. The windows were streaked with condensation, from within, not without. The mirrors had fogged entirely. And in one, just one, June saw her. A woman in red, standing behind him, veil covering her face, motionless. He turned. No one, but her image remained in the mirror, still watching. He spent the rest of the night reading the older scrolls, cross-referencing symbols, tracing sigils. He found her name, Lian, on a single record, buried in the corner of a marriage ledger dated 1979. A village girl, no family, died during a drought year. Cause of death, unknown. but the margin told the truth. Bride selected for ritual pairing with Liang Bao. Final rites aborted. Reason: spirit unrest. Signs of possession: uncontainable sorrow. Ritual outcome: failure. Bride remains untethered. Recommendation: containment. June shivered. They hadn't buried her. They had trapped her, bound her to the lantern like an animal, cursed her spirit with denial, betrayal, and silence. He lit the brazier in the middle of the room and placed the scroll into the flames, not as a rite, but as an apology. The parchment curled, blackened, vanished. Ash rose like breath, and in the glow of the fire, June saw it again. A figure, this time standing outside the window, motionless. The veil lifted just enough to show teeth gritted in agony. The next morning, the village was restless. People gathered at the banyan tree. June approached quietly, careful not to speak. The red ribbons hanging from the branches were burned at the ends. Several had snapped and fallen. At the base of the tree, the wooden covering of the buried lanterns had cracked open. Wen Da stood at the edge of the pit, his face pale. One of the lanterns, the black one, had vanished. Only the red remained half buried in cold ash. June turned away before anyone noticed. He walked back to the house, to the altar, to the place where the other black lantern still waited. But he knew there weren't two lanterns anymore. There was only one, and it was already here. Wei Jun stood at the threshold of the altar room, eyes locked on the lantern. Its glow no longer flickered. It breathed, a steady pulse, red and low, like the rhythm of a buried heart. The bones wrapped in bridal cloth still sat beside it, but now the silk had begun to blacken and fray, as if fire had licked it from within. The urn was cracked wider, and ash spilled in a crescent across the altar's surface. He whispered a blessing under his breath. It dissolved in the air. This room had ceased to belong to the living. Jun needed answers, not from scrolls or dreams, but from someone who had been there, someone who knew the truth before it was buried with incense and silence. He went to the temple. Wen Da was not there, but someone else waited inside. An old man sitting cross-legged on the wooden floor, his robes gray with age, his hair tied in a loose knot. He looked up when Jun entered. "You are Zhao Nian's blood?" Jun bowed. "Yes, her grandson." The man nodded slowly. "Then she has left you her burden." His name was Master Lu, once a Taoist priest who had served the village before Wen Da's time. He had been banished, Jun learned, not for blasphemy, but for refusing to complete a ritual. That ritual had been Lian's ghost marriage, the failed one. He told Jun the story. A girl found orphaned in a neighboring province, taken in by distant cousins who offered her for a ghost wedding to a wealthy boy who had drowned. It was meant to bring honor, closure, peace to both families. But something was wrong. The spirit of the girl was not calm. She resisted. The red threads they tied to her urn burned through before the ritual could be completed. The effigies screamed in the fire. The black lantern, once empty, began to flicker before it was lit. Even the officiating monk fell unconscious, bleeding from his nose, his tongue blackened. So your grandmother, Zhao Nian, made a choice. Master Lu's voice cracked. She broke the rite. She substituted the remains, bound the real ashes beneath the altar, and sealed the soul inside the lantern. It was not a mistake. It was protection. Jun's mouth was dry. And the offering? Lu looked down. There was only one way to bind her. He reached into his sleeve and removed a folded talisman, old and faded. On it were the characters "Forbidden Union." She needed to believe she had married. She needed blood from someone she trusted, someone of her line. Jun followed. So now she wants me? Master Lu nodded. You are the last Zhao Nian blood. That night, Jun performed a simple rite for guidance. He sat before the altar, surrounded by salt and crushed peach leaves, as the scrolls instructed. He cut his palm, let the blood drip into the brass bowl. He whispered Lian's name, not as a priest, but as an heir. The lantern pulsed. Then a voice, not from outside, but from within. It echoed in the marrow of his bones. You carry her sin. You carry my vow. You will finish it. You will wed. The floor beneath him buckled. For a moment he felt weightless. Then he was inside the vision again. Not a dream, something deeper. He stood beside a riverbank under a full moon. A bride waited beneath a black parasol. Behind her, rows of villagers with no faces, their heads bowed, their hands folded in prayer. She turned, lifted her veil. Lian's face was scorched, her eyes hollow, her lips sewn shut with red thread. But she smiled anyway, and reached out her hand. Jun stepped back. Blood dripped from his palm into the earth. The ground opened. He fell through. He woke on the floor, shaking, soaked with sweat. The cut in his hand was gone, but a mark had formed on his wrist, a red ring, thin as thread. He went to see Mei the next day, found her kneeling before the banyan tree, laying offerings in silence. She didn't turn when he approached. I saw her, Jun whispered. Mei nodded. She's chosen you then. She looked at him finally, eyes heavy, lips pale. Then you only have one chance to bind her properly, to unmake the lie your grandmother began. Jun sat beside her. And what happens if I don't? Mei didn't speak. She only held out her wrist, revealed the same red thread ring burned into her skin. I was meant to be the bride this year, but the lantern chose you instead. The elders are preparing, she said. They think if you offer your blood willingly, the binding will hold, that she'll be satisfied, that she'll rest. But it's not true. Jun's voice broke. Then what does she want? Mei's answer was simple. She wants what was promised. A real wedding, a real union, a real groom. That night, Jun lit the final candle on the altar. He laid out the bones, the ribbon, the urn, and then he placed his own blood offering into the lantern. The glass glowed white-hot for a moment, then red, then black again. A voice whispered, louder now, clear. Soon. And in the mirror behind him, she stood, no longer veiled, no longer smiling, only waiting. The village awoke to the sound of drums, not loud, not joyous, just a slow, hollow beat, like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. Thump, pause, thump, pause. Wei Jun opened his eyes and knew without checking the drum wasn't coming from the temple. It was coming from the banyan tree. Outside, the fog had returned, thicker than before. The rooftops vanished into the gray. Chickens did not crow, no fires were lit. The villagers moved like shadows, heads bowed, mouths closed. Jun passed 3 people on his way to the shrine. None made eye contact. Only one old man whispered as Jun passed him, "The thread has chosen." At the foot of the banyan tree, red string had been tied between every branch. Hundreds of strands woven like a web, crisscrossing and pulling downward, as if the tree were being stitched closed by invisible hands. At the center of the roots sat the drum. An old ritual drum, wood darkened with age, skin cracked. It struck itself. No stick touched it, no hand moved, but it beat, slowly, like breath, like waiting. Jun turned and saw the elder standing at the far side of the shrine. Wenda was among them. He held something in his hands, a folded robe, deep red, trimmed in black thread. It was a groom's robe. Jun did not move. He didn't need to ask. The choice had been made. That evening, the villagers held the rehearsal, a ceremonial walk through the ghost wedding ritual meant to entertain the younger generation, or so they claimed. It had become a performance in recent years, part tradition, part theater. Red lanterns were lit along the paths, paper brides folded with careful hands, the village girls dressed in red gowns and paraded through the square. But Jun could see the truth behind the masks. Every villager watched him from the corners of their eyes. Every bell that rang was a signal. Every red thread tied to the banyan tree whispered of binding. And May walked in the procession, her face painted white, her lips sealed with wax, her hands folded as if in mourning. She passed him without speaking, but her eyes screamed. After the rehearsal, Jun returned home. The altar room was colder than ever. The black lantern pulsed steadily now, no longer angry, no longer restless, just certain. He found a red cord coiled around the altar's base, one end looped around the lantern's handle, the other curled neatly beside his pillow. He hadn't placed it there, neither had anyone else. It had tied itself, waiting for the knot to be finished. That night the dreams returned, but they were not dreams, they were memories that did not belong to him. He stood in a field of lanterns, hundreds of them, all black, all lit from within. Each one held a face, each one wept. And at the center, Leon stood. She was no longer burned, no longer veiled. Her eyes were whole, but empty. Her lips moved, but no sound came. She lifted her arms, a red ribbon uncoiled from her wrist, reaching through the air, twisting toward him like a snake. It wrapped around his neck, soft at first, then pulled. He awoke, gasping. The thread was on his pillow, knotted. At dawn, Wenda arrived. He did not speak at first, only bowed and set the groom's robe on the table. "The village is ready." Jun stared at the cloth. "And if I refuse?" Wenda didn't answer. He simply looked at Jun's wrist. The thread mark had deepened, red, swollen, like it was growing under the skin. "She chose you," he said, "and you carry her sin." Later, May came to the house. She did not enter, only stood at the door, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. "You have one chance. The rite must be completed. You must let her believe that this is real, that this is final. And then, maybe, she'll release you." Jun shook his head. "And if I fail?" May's voice broke. "Then she'll bind to you forever, not as a bride, as something worse." That night the drums beat faster. The fog refused to lift. And inside the altar room, Jun saw something new. The lantern had opened. Just slightly. Its glass was cracked at the base. A thin thread of red smoke leaked from within. And inside, pressed against the glass, was Leon's face. Not screaming, not pleading, smiling, waiting.
The sky above Lantern Village had turned the color of dried blood. Not red, not orange, but that strange, bruised hue just before the storm arrives, heavy with unspoken things. Wei Jun stood by the mirror, staring at his reflection. But it no longer mirrored him. The man inside the glass wore the same robe, the same thread-marked wrist, but his eyes were different. They weren't afraid. They were hollow, waiting, like the eyes of someone who had already crossed a line and left his shadow behind. He put on the groom's robe at dusk. It fit too well. The fabric was old, but untouched by moths. It smelled faintly of incense and ash, and something else beneath that, something older than death. He tied the sash around his waist and sat before the altar. The black lantern was open now, cracked fully along the glass, but still glowing. It no longer needed to hold her, because she had already stepped out. Wei Jun lit 3 sticks of incense, not from devotion, but from necessity. The moment the smoke touched the air, the candle beside the lantern flared, casting the room in dancing red. And then, without warning, the altar changed. It was no longer wood and dust. It became a wedding table, set with offerings, 2 urns, 2 cups, red thread stretched between them like a lifeline pulled too tight. He blinked and found himself somewhere else. A temple corridor, carpets of red, walls of black lacquer, every inch draped in silk veils, fluttering as if someone had just passed. He walked slowly, and the air moved around him, soft, breathing. At the end of the corridor, she waited. Liane, dressed in her wedding gown, the same one from the visions, the one scorched around the hem, the one that still dripped blood from a seam no living tailor had ever sewn. She lifted her face. This time, he saw her eyes. They weren't empty. They were full of something far worse, longing. "You are the groom," she whispered without words. "You were always meant to be." She raised a red cord, the same one that had burned into his wrist. Now she held it in her fingers like a vow made real. She stepped forward and wrapped it around his neck. Soft, gentle, until it wasn't. Jun gasped. He was back in the room, on the floor, hands at his throat. No mark, but the weight of the cord remained. He stumbled outside into the night. Lanterns lined the streets again,
but not red, black. Every doorway had one, every window, and inside each flickered a face, a different one, each of them whispering something he couldn't hear. As he passed, their flames tilted toward him, not in welcome, in recognition. The banyan tree loomed ahead. At its base stood May. She had tied her hair back, dressed in mourning white. A thread of red hung from her ear like an earring. When she saw Jun, she nodded once. "It's tonight." Jun barely found his voice. "It's not real, is it?" She looked at the thread on his wrist. "It is for her." The ritual would begin at midnight. Jun had only hours left to prepare. Back inside the house, he searched through his grandmother's hidden scrolls one last time. Near the bottom of a pile, beneath brittle rice paper and faded diagrams, he found a single sheet marked with a black seal. A forbidden rite. The unbinding prayer. A final contingency. It required a groom, a kiss, and a lie. You must let the spirit believe the marriage is real. You must complete the kiss. And then, while she believes she is no longer alone, you speak the prayer in silence and trap her back inside the lantern. One chance, one breath. Jun placed the scroll inside his robe. He turned back to the altar. The lantern had gone dark, but the room was still filled with red. From the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if the world had already become the wedding veil. Later, as the village prepared the ceremonial path, Jun stood alone at the threshold of the banyan forest. May joined him there, quiet and pale. "There's one more thing," she said. "Once the rite begins, no one can help you. Not me, not the elders." She handed him something, a paper bride, small and folded, marked with the name Lian. Jun held it carefully. The paper was cold. "She is not evil," May whispered. "She was left behind, and she doesn't want to be forgotten again." Jun nodded. He understood now. She had never wanted revenge, only fulfillment. Only the promise made to her by people who thought they could control the dead and walk away untouched. But the dead remembered. They always did. The drums began again. Slower now, softer, calling him home.
The lanterns were already lit when Jun arrived at the edge of the banyan grove. They glowed like dying stars in the fog, dozens of them strung low between the trees, swaying in a wind no one could feel. Each one black, each one silent. A path had been cleared beneath the hanging roots, marked by red ash and scattered petals. It wound through the earth like a scar, leading to the old ceremonial hollow, the burial site used in every lantern rite. The banyan tree loomed above it all, its branches thick with red thread, its roots gnarled and swollen, like something that had been feeding for centuries. Trun stood at the start of the path, dressed in the groom's robe, the paper bride tucked inside his sleeve, the unbinding prayer memorized and sealed in blood. Behind him, no one followed. This part of the ritual was for him alone. The forest swallowed him in silence. Each step felt heavier than the last. The air grew colder, thicker, pressing down on his shoulders like wet fabric. He passed the first lantern. Inside its cracked glass, a face flickered, not angry, not mournful, but watching. Then another, and another. Dozens of faces, all with veils, all with smiles that didn't reach the eyes. They turned toward him as he passed, though their mouths never moved. "Welcome," they whispered without words. "Welcome, husband."
At the center of the clearing stood the hollow, a deep pit rimmed with stone, wrapped in decaying cloth. Chun stepped to its edge and looked down. 2 urns rested within, just like the rite dictated, but beside them sat something else. Another lantern. His grandmother's, the original, blackened, cracked, but now fully open. He climbed down into the hollow. His boots sank slightly into the ash. The scent hit him immediately. Burnt silk, old blood, and something like bridal perfume left too long in the sun. He knelt before the urns. The silence was total. Then a sound. Footsteps. Soft. Behind him. He turned, and she was there, Lian. Not as a vision, not as a flicker of flame, but standing, veil fluttering around her like smoke, gown dragging across the ash with a sound like tearing cloth. Her face was pale and whole, her hands held out, thread coiled around her wrists like bangles. She stepped into the hollow. The drums from the village faded. All that remained was the sound of her breath, shallow, hopeful. Chun bowed. She stopped in front of him. He lifted the paper bride from his sleeve and set it gently between them. Lian looked down. Then, slowly, she smiled. Her mouth opened, revealing teeth stained red, as if she had bitten through time to get here. She reached out and touched his cheek, cold, gentle, final. The thread slipped from her wrist and wound around his. 1 loop, then 2, then 3. Chun didn't resist. He let it coil, let it claim. He reached for her veil, lifted it, and saw the face of a woman who had never known peace, eyes rimmed in soot, lips cracked with prayers unsaid, but still beautiful in her sorrow. Their foreheads touched, the thread pulsed, the lantern beside them flared, and the kiss began. Chun pressed his lips to hers. There was no warmth, only memory. She trembled. Her fingers clutched his arm, and for a heartbeat, the ash beneath them stilled. No sound, no breath, no lanterns. Only the moment, only the lie. He whispered the unbinding prayer, silently, within the kiss, each word a cut through the thread, each syllable a promise broken. She pulled away, eyes wide. She had heard him. The hollow exploded with wind. Ash spiraled upward in violent swirls. The urns shattered. The lanterns above burst into flame. Lian screamed, not from rage, but from betrayal. Again. Again. Her scream cracked the fog open. The thread between them burned red hot, slicing into Chun's wrist. He dropped to his knees. She backed away, but the thread held. She couldn't retreat, not fully, not yet. The prayer had bound her to the lantern once more, but it had not finished, not all the way. The forest trembled, the banyan groaned, its roots shifting. Blood, thick and black, seeped from the hollow walls. Chun reached for the lantern, now glowing brighter than ever. He grabbed its handle, chanted the final line aloud. The wind screamed. Lian rushed at him and vanished into the light. The flame sealed. The thread dropped. Ash rained like snow, and silence returned. Chun crawled from the hollow. The village lanterns had gone dark. The faces were gone. The forest no longer breathed. But the lantern in his hand still glowed, not with rage, not with sorrow, but with something far more dangerous: memory. He returned to the house before sunrise. placed the lantern back on the altar, and for the first time in generations, it did not flicker. It burned, steady, quiet. Lian had been sealed, but she had not forgotten. The wind did not return to Lantern Village, even after the ritual, even after the scream, even after the thread burned and the lantern dimmed. Everything remained still, unnaturally still, like the world had been paused between breaths and no one dared to exhale. Wei Jun stood in his grandmother's house, facing the altar. The black lantern rested there, unchanged since the sealing, but it no longer flickered with rage or longing. It glowed steady, like an eye that had finally closed. And yet, he could feel her, not in the room, but in him. The wound on his wrist had not healed. The thread mark had darkened, deep lead, like it had sunk deeper beneath the skin. It pulsed, faintly, in time with the lantern's glow. No pain, only presence, like a tether he could not sever. No matter how many rites he performed, no matter how many scrolls he burned, no matter how tightly he sealed the glass, it began with reflections. First the mirror in the hallway. He passed it without thinking, and saw her standing beside him, not behind, beside, a bride in red, silent, smiling, her veil untouched, but her eyes, they were no longer hollow. They were watching him with affection, like a wife waiting for her husband to speak first. He smashed the mirror. It didn't shatter, only rippled, like the glass had turned to water for a breath, then went still again. Her image gone, but not gone, just watching from elsewhere. He found Wen Da the next morning, told him everything, the lantern, the sealing, the prayer, the mark. Wen Da listened, unmoving. Then he said only this: "You did not seal her. You wed her." Jun's mouth went dry. "But I used the unbinding prayer." Wen Da shook his head. "You spoke it while holding the thread. You sealed her into the lantern, yes, but through the rite, she sealed you." The elders gathered that night. They examined Jun's wrist. One by one they placed talismans against his skin. Every one of them curled, browned, and crumbled to ash. Even the sacred gold seals, even the red dust sigils, none held. Master Lu returned to the village after hearing the news. He held Jun's arm in silence, then whispered, "She's not possessing you. She's inside you." That night, the village drum shattered, split clean down the center with no one touching it. The banyan tree wept black sap that burned the ground where it landed. And at every doorstep, the ceremonial lanterns, even the ones unlit for decades, flickered to life, each one showing the same image, a bride in red, hands folded, waiting. Jun began to lose time. He would blink and find himself standing in the temple, or kneeling before the banyan tree. Once he awoke at the foot of the altar, whispering vows in a dialect he had never learned. He found words carved into the walls, thin scratches like from fingernails. "You are mine. You are bound. You are enough." He stopped lighting incense. It no longer masked her presence. It only fed it. On the 7th night after the sealing, the villagers found one of the elders dead. his body seated before his family altar, mouth open, lungs blackened as if scorched from the inside. The air in the room was cold, but his chest had been burned from within. In his lap rested a folded wedding invitation written in blood. Wei Jun and Lin, united by thread, unbroken. Mei came to him after the burial. Her hands trembled. "You have to leave," she said. "You have to run. She won't follow far beyond the mountain." Jun laughed hollow. "I don't think she's following me. I think I'm carrying her." Mei said nothing, only looked at the lantern behind him. It glowed brightly, joyfully. That night, Jun watched his reflection again. But this time something was different. He saw himself, but wearing the red robe, the veil on his head. The groom was gone. He was now the bride. And Lin? She was the one holding his hand, guiding him down the path, back to the hollow, back beneath the banyan. The flame inside the lantern flared. Smoke rose from the wood beneath the altar, and the threads on his wrist split open. And in that moment he understood. The ritual had never been about sealing her. It had been about replacing himself. A groom for a ghost, a body for a spirit, a vessel willingly given. And now the wedding was still ongoing, not completed, not finished, only paused until the kiss was repeated, without lies, without prayers, only surrender.
The air in Lantern Village had grown too quiet. Not the stillness of peace, but the hush before something returns, before something is reborn. Wei Jun sat alone in the ancestral room, robe loosened, hands trembling, heart slow. The lantern on the altar no longer glowed with hunger or vengeance. It glowed like hope. And that terrified him more than any scream. He had spent the last 3 days in trance-like states, slipping in and out of places he didn't remember walking to, speaking words he didn't know, finding himself holding red thread without recalling how it reached his hands. One morning, he woke at the village shrine, barefoot, with ash covering his sleeves, and a folded veil in his lap. Another time, he woke in the temple, kneeling before the cracked drum, whispering vows in a voice that didn't sound like his own. The boundary between him and Lian was thinning, and soon it would vanish entirely. Mei found him near the well at dusk. Her voice was soft. "She's preparing." Jun didn't look up. "So am I." He reached into his sleeve and handed her something. A scroll. The unbinding prayer. "I won't use it again." She froze. "You can't mean that." He looked at his wrist, where the thread had now burned into flesh, red and raw, like a third vein pulsing beside his own. "She's inside me. I can feel her thoughts, her sorrow. She doesn't want destruction. She wants completion." Mei's voice cracked. "And you're just going to give yourself to her?" He finally turned to face her. "No. I'm going to marry her." That night, Jun prepared the altar with precision. He cleared every speck of dust, burned old offerings, lit only 3 candles, the sacred number for binding, not release. In front of the lantern, he placed the objects the ritual required. A red silk cord, a mirror, a bowl of water, a tooth, one of hers, wrapped in cloth, and a lock of his own hair. He sat cross-legged and waited.
The room grew colder, the shadows lengthened, and then she came. Not through the door, not from the walls. She simply stepped out of the flame. Leanne, the widow bride. Her gown moved like smoke, trailing ribbons that never touched the floor. Her face was calm now, not furious, not mournful, but certain. She reached for the red cord, tied one end around his wrist, tied the other around her own. No words, no chants, only silence. And in that silence, the bond sealed. June whispered, "I give myself freely. I finish what they began. I do not seal you. I receive you." The candles flared, the water in the bowl rippled, the mirror cracked down the middle, and her eyes filled with tears, real ones, not illusion, not ghostlight, salt and water from a soul long denied its tears. She leaned forward, touched her forehead to his. June closed his eyes and let her in. What followed was not pain, it was memory. He saw her as a girl standing at the edge of the river where she died, saw her shivering in a bridal robe too large for her, saw her watching the elders burn false offerings, bury fake ashes, and turn away. He felt her despair, her betrayal, her long years sealed in smoke and silence, clinging to the lie of a love that never came. He wept for her, and she wept through him. The ritual was not violent, it was intimate. He became her sanctuary, and she his truth. When it was over, the candles extinguished themselves. The red cord unraveled and vanished into smoke, and Leanne stepped back, her form beginning to fade, not in pain, not in vengeance, but in release. Not into the lantern, not into the floor, but into him. A final breath passed between them, and she was gone. The lantern turned black, the glass shattered without a sound, and the ashes beneath the altar blew away like dust escaping a tomb. June sat in stillness. Inside there was no invasion, no possession, only presence. A part of him now belonged to her, and a part of her would rest in him forever. The ritual had ended, but the bond had not, because love, even when broken, leaves something behind.